July 14, 1941. The railway station near Orsha, Belarus. Oberleutnant Rudolf Hartmann, the supply officer of the 23rd Motorized Corps, stood by the map, pinning markers to the new route. Everything was going according to plan. The Soviet defense, according to his information, had fallen apart, and the trains carrying ammunition were arriving on time. A few more days and the road to Smolensk will be clear, he tossed to his adjutant as he closed his folder. The sun was just rising. The locomotives gave off bluish-gray smoke. Strange trucks with long frames stood along the field. Hartmann glanced at them, some Russian vehicles, abandoned in haste, not worth paying attention to. A moment later the ground shuddered. From the frames burst 16 fiery trails, a short, blinding salvo. 7 seconds and the station disappeared in a storm of flame and metal. Explosions swept away the trains, scattered people, tore the silence to shreds. Hartmann fell to the ground, stunned and blinded. He did not know that he had just become the first German officer to see the Red Army's new weapon, the very thing his soldiers would soon call Stalin's organ. In the summer of 1941, German officers spoke confidently about the superiority of their army. After a rapid advance eastward, they had grown used to thinking of the war as almost a solved problem. Newspapers wrote of the collapsing Soviet machine, radio broadcasts promised the swift end of the campaign. There was a sense of mathematical order in the headquarters, as if everything had already been counted, measured, and laid out in days and kilometers. Officers at the front regarded the Soviet troops as an outdated force that had neither equipment, nor industry, nor imagination. Reports noted, the Russians fight stubbornly, but their weapons are primitive and their commanders cumbersome. That confidence reinforced a feeling of superiority dangerous in its blindness. Even when reconnaissance reported strange trucks with frames seen in the rear, no one paid attention. Warfield kitchen wagons, they joked in the officers' tents. No one could imagine that those modest silhouettes would soon mark the beginning of a new stage of the war. The German army was used to a war in which everything was subordinated to the logic of artillery and armored wedges. Every shot had to have a target, every shell, coordinates. But the enemy they faced fought differently. Deep within Soviet territory, behind the fences of research institutes, engineers and officers argued through the nights. They were called dreamers because they tried to make rockets serve artillery. At the time it seemed impossible that iron projectiles without barrels could fly accurately and in concert. But it was in those laboratories that the idea was born that would change the course of the war. The main inspirer was Georgy Langmack, a scientist who believed that the future of artillery lay not in guns but in rockets. His name would later disappear from documents, but it was he who laid the foundations of reactive weaponry. Together with engineers Ivan Gvoy and Boris Petropavlovsky, they developed the first M13 rocket projectiles. The fuel for them smelled of acid, the launch guides rusted, but every successful shot brought them closer to the dream to create a launcher that could unleash a whole storm of fire on the enemy in seconds. In those years few believed in success. Traditional artillery seemed more reliable and proven. At General Staff meetings, skeptics asked, "Why do we need toys? We have guns." But those who stood by the test grounds saw something else. They saw night torn by light, the sky trembling from the roar of dozens of reactive projectiles. It was a spectacle of the future, like nothing before. In 1939, when Europe beyond the USSR's borders was already blazing, the country accelerated all-secret work. Thus the first prototypes of combat vehicles on the ZIS-6 chassis appeared. The designers tried to combine simplicity and power, metal rails, easy aiming, a minimum of moving parts. The vehicle could be assembled in a workshop and hidden under a tarpaulin. No one could have guessed that before them stood the weapon of a new century. By 1941, the launchers were ready. There were few of them, only a few dozen, concentrated in experimental batteries. At the time, no one knew what importance they would one day gain. Even the creators themselves could not imagine that their brainchild would become a symbol of the war, as recognizable as the word victory. In the spring of 1941, the final tests were successful. By order of the People's Commissariat of Armaments, the machines received the index BM13. Thus began the story of what soldiers would simply and affectionately call Katyusha. The name was taken from a popular pre-war song about a girl waiting for her beloved at the front. It sounded soft and gentle, yet behind that name hid a power equal to thunder. From an idea once dismissed as fantasy, a weapon was born that could, in mere seconds, overturn the very concept of warfare. And when the first machines went to the front, no one knew that what awaited them was not just fame, but immortality. Thus began the path of the Soviet Thunder. Work on the new weapon continued under the cover of night, but those nights brought no relief. At the test range, people often gathered exhausted from cold and lack of sleep, their hands stained with resin and acidic grime. Every launch tested not only the machinery but their endurance. Engines failed, rails broke, rockets fell short of the target or exploded just after launch. Dust and sparks covered the faces of those who still believed, while many began to doubt. Criticism came from above. In offices they spoke of waste, of senseless spending in the year before war. At meetings harsh words were said, it would be better to invest in proven artillery. The engineers heard this and returned to their workshops, where drawings and scorched fragments of test rockets lay on the tables. Sometimes it seemed the entire project would be declared dead after yet another machine fell apart against the rocky mound of the testing ground. There were human losses too. Those who worked with fuel and ignition mixtures faced burns and poisoning. The field medical log recorded names of people who never returned to the tests. One day, a faulty part caused an explosion. 3 people were seriously injured, and the laboratory where calculations were conducted was partially destroyed. The news spread beyond the plant, reaching even the nearby villages. The word failure hung in the air, heard even by those who could not read the reports. Yet among fatigue and fear, a quiet persistence burned on. At night, when most had gone home, 2 or 3 remained checking connections, repairing joints, making sure the rails stood straight. Their eyes were filled with impatient calculation, and with something that could only be called faith that mistakes could be corrected, that errors could be turned into experience. And then, one of those late hours, after a series of failures, a group of engineers assembled the repaired parts, replacing what broke most often. Their hands trembled, but they worked silently. The first launch showed the rocket took the proper trajectory, the explosion went off beyond the test range, and the silence after the salvo was not anxious. It was different, filled with possibility. Someone murmured a single word under their breath, possible. That faint possible became the spark that kept the project from being forgotten entirely. July 14, 1941. The morning was clear but cold, carrying the faint smell of smoke drifting from burning villages. Near the station at Orsha stood German trains, tankers, fuel wagons, trucks, and staff cars. People bustled about, some repairing wiring, others writing in their logs. Everything seemed routine and reliable. A few kilometers away, in a small grove where the grass was still wet with dew, stood 4 vehicles covered with branches. Their crews, young soldiers, engineers, and artillerymen, were gathered into a special battery. Their commander, Captain Ivan Andreevich Flarov, silently checked the calculations. He was a calm man, almost slow in appearance, but his eyes betrayed the tension. Behind him was not just a new weapon, but responsibility for something no other army in the world possessed. The order was brief: strike the railway junction where enemy troops and equipment were concentrated. Distance, about 7 kilometers. Weather, favorable. Checking connections, sighting, angle calculations, it all took only a few minutes. In the silence of dawn, it seemed even the birds had gone quiet. Flarov raised his hand. A second, and the sky lit up. 16 rockets tore away almost simultaneously, leaving smoky trails behind them. The air trembled. The forest shuddered as if from a gust of wind. Moments later, a wall of fire rose on the horizon. Where the German trains had stood, the earth became a seething sea of flames. 7 seconds, that was the length of the salvo. But in those 7 seconds, the iron logic of the German headquarters was destroyed. Dozens of wagons ignited, fuel exploded, metal structures melted in the heat. People ran in the smoke, not understanding where death had come from. For many, it was the first and last day of the war. Flarov stood by his vehicle, watching the horizon. His face showed no joy, only exhaustion, and the understanding of the weapon they had created. It had proven its power. No one spoke a word. The soldiers quickly packed up the equipment, secured the rails, and started the engines. Within minutes, the machines disappeared, melting into the morning mist. They knew the return fire would begin any moment, and staying put was impossible. In the German reports of that day it was written, an unknown enemy weapon caused powerful explosions in the area of the station. Losses significant. Presumably, aviation. Only later, after similar attacks were repeated, did the Germans realize that it was not aircraft, but vehicles firing in salvos. Then, for the first time, a name appeared: Stalin's organ. That first strike was more than a successful experiment. It marked the beginning of a new era in artillery, where the count was not in shots, but in seconds. 7 seconds, and the enemy understood that the East could respond not only with numbers, but with invention. Flarov's battery would soon move further west, into battles where there would be neither rest nor return. But the memory of Orsha would remain forever as the morning when Russia first spoke with thunder. Those 7 seconds entered history as the moment when war changed its voice. After Orsha, the word Katyusha became a symbol of an unknown power. But behind that symbol stood hard, almost suicidal labor. The batteries armed with the new launchers quickly realized that their weapon was unlike any other. It struck not a point, but an entire area, unleashing not a shell, but a storm. Yet it was that very storm that made them vulnerable. After the first salvo, the Germans immediately opened return fire. Their artillery was precise, calculated, disciplined. If a Katyusha delayed even for a minute, the chances of survival dropped sharply. Thus was born a rule that would become an inseparable part of Soviet artillery culture: fire, then disappear. The batteries began to live by a new rhythm. At night they took positions, carefully camouflaged, checked communications, and waited for the order. The salvo lasted less than 10 seconds. Then came the instant withdrawal. Sometimes they had to drive straight through forests or swamps to escape German spotters. Soldiers said each launch was like the breath of a beast, short, powerful, and followed by silence in which life was decided. Logistics became as much a trial as fire itself. There were never enough rockets. Roads were shattered, fuel had to be found by chance. But each time they managed to deliver ammunition and move the launchers into position, the crews knew their few seconds could change the course of a battle. Gradually, the tactic of massed fire was born. Several batteries acted together, showering the enemy with tens of tons of explosives. The enemy had no time to take cover, and most importantly, lost their moral balance. Wehrmacht officers wrote that the Russians have found a way to make the earth sing. For the Germans, that sound became a nightmare. The Soviet command quickly realized the power of the new weapon. Entire regiments were created for it, guard units were formed. But glory did not cancel deadly risk. The crews knew that each firing could be their last. They did not seek heroism, they simply did their duty. The hit-and-vanish tactic required not only speed, but inner calm. Those who manned the Katyushas learned to see war as a chain of moments. In those moments they combined the precision of engineers with the composure of soldiers. From fear of return fire grew a new discipline, from chaos a system, from a 7-second salvo a strategy. Thus, war taught those who commanded the thunder the art of disappearance. As the war entered its hardest phase, Katyusha ceased to be a rarity and became a phenomenon. On the fields of Stalingrad and Kursk, in offensives and counterattacks, the launchers appeared more and more often, changing not only tactics, but the soldiers' morale. Where once there had been a steady line of trenches and calculations, now, above the map, loomed a new symbol, the possibility that at any moment a wall of fire could appear and change everything. These machines did not bring parades or triumphs, they brought decisive moments. Supporting advancing troops, they destroyed strongholds, shattered defensive lines, helped the infantry break through where it had once failed. Yet their greatest impact was not the physical destruction, but the effect Katyusha had on the spirit of both sides. A Soviet soldier, hearing the familiar whine, knew that nearby was a force capable of protecting his step. A German soldier, caught in the sudden storm, stopped believing that his map guaranteed safety. Groups of batteries now acted in unison. One artillery wave followed another, and the enemy regiments, used to precise steel and calculated strikes, found themselves in an unfamiliar sea of fire. Commanders noted that, when used correctly, rocket artillery eliminated the need for costly assaults, saved manpower and time, and offered a chance for advance without excessive bloodshed. Witnesses of those days did not speak of glory, they spoke of weight. In letters home, soldiers wrote of nights when the sky glowed like oiled steel, and of thunder that sounded like a sentence. They did not celebrate. They accepted the fact and moved on. For many, Katyusha became a sign of survival. For those who stood behind the launch rails, a test of endurance and courage. As the years passed, the sound of the salvos became an image of history. In posters and stories, it appeared as a symbol of resistance. Yet in the people's memory it carried other shades as well: gratitude for protection, horror at destruction, and quiet sorrow for those who never returned. The moment of glory for the Katyusha was not one of brilliance or spectacle, but of hard, concentrated labor, a moment when engineering genius and human self-sacrifice merged into a single, brief flash that could change the fate of battalions and decide the outcome of battles. Every salvo of the Katyusha had its reverse side: silent, terrible, inevitable. Those who operated this weapon knew that the fire they unleashed would soon come back at them as a reflected wave. After each strike, the hunt began. German scouts searched for traces of the launchers. Artillery shelled the grid squares. Aircraft swept the fields. The lifetime of a battery was measured in days, sometimes hours. Many crews perished right where their machines had just stood. One shell could hit the fuel, and in a moment the whole launcher would turn into a torch. No one survived. Soldiers called it the silence after thunder, that brief instant of calm before the fire consumed everything. The legendary flare of battery, which had opened the way for this weapon, did not escape the same fate. In the autumn of 1941, surrounded near Smolensk, they fought with no chance of escape. When their ammunition ran out, Flarov's men set their last vehicles ablaze so they would not fall into enemy hands. None of them surrendered. Later, at the site of their death, charred launch rails and twisted barrels were found, frozen like a monument to their own salvo. Those who survived in other units rarely spoke of fear. They spoke of duty and of the sound one could never forget. After the war, their hair turned gray too soon, their hands trembled. Yet whenever the song Katyusha was played, they lifted their eyes, not out of pride, but remembrance. The price had been immense. Each salvo took the lives of those who fired it. But it was thanks to these people that a weapon born as an experiment became a legend. They had no time for glory, no right to fear, only one duty: to fire one more time, while strength remained, before the sky went dark. There are no victories without losses. The fire of the Katyusha lit the road to victory, but its flame burned those who stood closest to it. When the dust of war settled and Europe once again heard the bells of peace, the name Katyusha needed no explanation. It had become part of memory itself, part of the nation, like the Volga, like the Somme, like the word victory. In every town through which the front passed, there was a place where veterans remembered the first roar of rocket salvos. Each time, their voices carried not pride, but reverence for what had been accomplished. After 1945, engineers returned to their blueprints. The war's experience became a school unlike any other in the world. From simple racks on truck chassis grew an entire science. Thus were born the Grad, Uragan, and Smerch, descendants of that very launcher that had first struck near Orsha. They became symbols of a new era. Yet in each of them lived the memory of their ancestor. Rough, loud, but faithful. Sometimes, military experts from other countries tried to uncover the secret of the Katyusha's success. Some said it was the simplicity of its design, others, the sheer mass of fire, still others, its psychological effect. But the true strength of this weapon lay not in technology, it lay in the people who turned fear into confidence and loss into determination. There would have been no legend without those who lifted the launch rails in the rain, repaired engines on muddy roads, and carried rockets on their shoulders when the trucks sank into swamps. In the German archives, lines from officers' letters have survived: "Never before has the earth screamed so loudly. Never has there been a weapon that could make a man lose his will to resist in a single moment." These words were not an admission of weakness, but an acknowledgement of the scale of what had happened. The enemy respected the Katyusha just as its creators respected the price of its salvos. Over the years, the weapon became legend, and the legend a symbol of its era. Monuments with launch rails raised toward the sky appeared in dozens of cities. In parades, museums, and school textbooks, the name stood beside those of heroes and designers. For new generations, it became a reminder that true strength is born not of steel, but of will. Sometimes, old men sitting on benches whisper the name softly, as if speaking of a person. Katyusha, in that sound lives everything, the thunder of war in the breath of silence, memory and gratitude, pain and hope. It needs no explanation. The legacy of this weapon lies not only in metal or science, but in the human dignity it embodied. For everyone who saw its salvo understood, behind those 7 seconds stood years of labor, faith in the homeland, and a readiness to sacrifice oneself. That is why the Katyusha remained in history not just as a machine, but as the voice of a people who endured. The thunder born in fire became a song, and the song became eternal memory. Decades passed. The fields near Orsha are long overgrown with grass, and only a small stone slab stands where the first salvo once roared. On it are engraved simple words: "Here was born the Soviet thunder." The wind carries the scent of pine and iron, and it feels as though beneath the earth still sleeps the echo of those 7 seconds that changed the war. People come here not for celebration, but for silence. There is no music of parades, no glitter of medals, only the steady breathing of history, the quiet presence of memory. Children lay flowers, veterans stand in silence leaning on their canes, and the young read the inscription and, for the first time, understand that this is not legend but reality, one forged through fire and sweat. Time erases much, tire tracks, ash, the marks of hands on metal. But it cannot erase what has become part of human dignity. Katyusha lives not only in textbooks and museums, it lives in song, in the nation's heart, in the understanding that a country's strength is measured not by the number of its guns, but by its ability to remember. History does not repeat itself, but humanity repeats its lessons. Each new day brings its own trials. And in remembering those 7 seconds near Orsha, one can understand a simple truth: victory is born where there is faith, and memory lives where duty is not forgotten. The day when German officers laughed at the station became the day when history had already begun to write their sentence. We remember. We are grateful. We will not forget.